Last night, peaceful protests erupted in cities across the country over the decision by a New York grand jury not to indict police officer Daniel Pantaleo for choking 43-year-old black man Eric Garner to death. Demonstrators in cities from New York to Seattle blocked highways and staged die-ins to voice their deep frustration with a two-tiered justice system that shelters police from accountability time and again. So to understand this case from both a legal perspective and from the view of law enforcement, I'm joined now by Mike Papantonio, attorney and co-host of Ring of Fire Radio, and Ronald Hampton, criminal justice consultant, former. Thank you for coming on. Mike, I wanted to start with you. Let's talk about the legal aspects of the case. In your mind, how is it possible the grand jury did not indict Officer Pantaleo for Eric Garner's death?
Well, a grand jury system in a cop-killing setting like this fails in so many ways. The inherent conflict of interest issues are overwhelming. The legal infrastructure in place from the very beginning is so protective of policemen. The Supreme Court, in a series of rulings as far back as the 1980s, gave the police a green light where it comes to telling them that the total decision-making about the use of deadly force came down to whether the officer's subjective belief is that he or another officer in safety is threatened. It's called objective reasonableness, and it is bastardized in every way you can imagine when it comes to these kinds of cases.
And Ronald, as a former police officer, can you talk about what specific procedures were violated during the arrest and what you would have done differently?
Well, I think the specific procedures that was violated was the use of the chokehold, because it's illegal and outlawed in the state of New York as well as other city and municipal police departments. For a cigarette, a blue cigarette or something like that, or a single cigarette, I would have given maybe a citation. I also would have just talked to him, to be there and then have 4 or 5 other police officers surround him, and then the officer jump on his neck and apply the chokehold was really irregular, as well as, I think, excessive force.
Talking to someone, wow, what a concept. Thank you for that. And Mike, let's talk about the chokehold that Ronald just brought up, because the New York Police Department banned the use of the maneuver, as you just mentioned, 1993. We're talking about over 20 years ago. They're technically not illegal, though, under New York state law. How do you think that this fact played into the case?
Well, it's impossible to analyze the facts of this case without understanding why the chokehold was banned as off limits to begin with in New York. Now, they've made inroads when they can use it and when they can't use it. The argument being an officer can use it when his life or another person's life's in danger. But there are about a half a dozen other types of body-to-body restraints that work. In New York, even after they banned the use of that, Abby, the Civil Complaint Review Board received 200 reports of chokeholds every year, and that's a fraction of it. And I think it's really important to understand how violently dangerous the chokehold is. Usually it's not done properly. It crushes the windpipe. It obviously cuts off a steady flow of oxygen to the brain. In addition to that, it has the potential to close off the carotid artery, permanently injuring the carotid artery that supplies blood to the brain. When the coroner first determined to classify Garner's death as a homicide, those types of physical evidence were in front of him. He considered all that, and he still came away and said, yeah, this is a homicide.
He just brought up a very good point, Ronald. He's talking about how chokeholds, New York Police Department actually received 219 chokehold complaints just in the last year, and it actually has increased since it hasn't been that high since 2010. Why is it increasing so much? Why are there so many complaints? And also, why do you think there is no state or federal law against this?
Well, the history of the chokehold, and I think the attorney would agree, the use of it started in L.A., and then when Darrell Gates was the chief of police, and then there was the use of it being, they were using it, but they were using it improperly, and then there were deaths that occurred as a result of it, and then plus Darrell Gates, with his pompous self, made a racial remark regarding that black folk being subject to the chokehold would choke out quicker than white folk, and so, this was a lot of racial overtones to it, but the use of it is very dangerous because these guys aren't doctors, they are physicians, so they don't know how much pressure to apply, when to apply. So I think it's right to not have it. But police officers tend to use it in a very reckless kind of way, and that's why the complaints were made, because they think that they can use it when they don't. And so I think it ought to be seriously outlawed across the board. I tell you, if a citizen grabbed you around the neck and choked you, but you didn't out or die from it, then you would be charged with assault. But if you died from the chokehold, then the citizen would be charged with murder. But the problem is that we can't charge police officers with assault and murder because they're police officers. But we need to deal with that because that's what's preventing us from really prosecuting police officers for death at the hands of police officers.
And apparently they're using it constantly. I mean,
Absolutely.
Considering that this is 219 complaints, and those are just the people who are complaining. I mean, imagine how much
That's
is
exactly
happening.
and we're lucky that there haven't been any more deaths as a result of it because they use it improperly.
Right.
They use it improperly, and that's even more of a reason why we shouldn't be using it in the first place because we don't know how to use it and when to use it, as a matter of fact.
Mike, you were talking about grand juries, and you were talking about kind of, it's impossible to really know what's going on. And I wanted to talk about kind of the transparency process because we have no transcript. It seems like there's always a conflict of interest when you have local prosecutors overseeing proceedings, especially when it involves police officers. I mean, because of how closely they work with cops, how transparent is the process, and do you think it needs to be changed?
Well, I don't think you need grand juries. I think grand juries is usually a cop-out for a DA like we saw in this situation, like we saw in Ferguson. The bullet points to remember is that the prosecutors have limitless discretion in how and what evidence they're presenting to the friendly grand jury. These are people they're in front of all the time. What to emphasize, what to ignore. The DA here, who was at one time floating the idea of running as a Republican congressional representative in Staten Island, he needs the police department's support. So he has a bias that way, not just for cases every day, but his political future. Another point I think is really important is the officers who testify in these places, they're rarely confronted with any kind of serious cross-examination. What parades through the grand jury, Abby, are forensic experts that are highly paid. They're all self-assured. They're not cross-examined. But when you put those same experts in a courtroom, as I have so many times, and you have the opportunity to cross-examine them and get to the truth of what they're saying, they fall apart. That doesn't happen back there in the grand jury room where you have the police-friendly expert that passes without challenge. The prosecutor's most effective approach, I think this is critical to understand too, prosecutor's most effective approach to letting the policeman walk, like we saw here, is by overwhelming his friends on the jury with complex, choreographed presentations that provide zero cohesiveness, zero direction on substantiating an indictment at all. That's what happened here, I promise you, and that's what happened in Ferguson.
And that's what Mike is alluding to has been addressed in New York and other places for a very long time, the creation of a special prosecutor, a person who is appointed by the mayor or the governor to simply handle nothing but cases involving death by police officers. And that takes that, but it puts transparency in it, but it takes that personal relationship component because prosecutors work with police officers every day. They drink beer, they eat lunch with them because they rely on them to bring cases and to testify in these cases. So there's a relationship that has been going on for years and years and years, and whether it's New York, LA, Dallas, Houston, when we look at that relationship hinders the aggressive prosecution of police officers who kill people as well as police brutality cases also. So we need to have a special prosecutor, and I know our sister organization in New York was working with the governor last year, or the early part of this year, trying to get him to use the special prosecutor process in cases involving police officers.
I want to get both of your opinions on the next question because as a former police officer, I want to start with you. The camera issue. I mean, I think the most shocking thing to everyone is that this was on camera. There's absolutely no qualms about what we saw here. We saw a man getting choked out. He's dying. He's saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Over 6 times, dies on camera. I don't understand what the solution is because you have Obama saying he's going to give, millions of dollars to local police departments to give cameras. I don't know if that's really going to change anything.
Well, this brings back memories of Rodney King for one, because Rodney's beating was on camera too. And I think more than anything, the fact that it was shown so repeatedly helped move the people in this country to really recognize the problem. But you're right. I hope people take this as an indication that cameras are not the 100% solution to the problem of police brutality. I remember when we were talking about putting camera in cars because that was the solution to police brutality. And yet we still see police brutality. We still see images from the dash cams about the violation of police officers of citizens. And now we see it on camera. And this camera would have been certainly a body camera. It could have been a body camera that was being used by a police officer, on a police officer, that unveiled this a horrible act that took place. So cameras are important, and I think we can use that. But if we go into this thinking that cameras are going to solve the problem, then we're going to miss the boat, and we're going to continue to have this because cameras are not the 100% solution.
There's
to the
something
problem.
more systemic to this, and I think there's also been many instances where cops have actually turned off their body cams when they have been employed before.
Well, we have to address
there's
the
actually
culture of the organization and the individuals in the organization. If we don't do that, cameras won't do anything.
We have about 45 seconds left, Mike, but do you have any closing thoughts on what you think would be the solution here?
Well, the only solution is to change the culture, and some of that has to do with how you screen police officers as they come through. We've reached a point in that we're very sophisticated in understanding how to do an MMPI profile on somebody that has the ability, A, not to react in fear every time they're put in a fearful situation, but B, how to operate within some element of good sense. We have tests that can tell you everything you want to know about whether somebody's well suited to do this or not. We need to start making that part of the police culture, and we'll weed out a lot of the problems here. Some people just are not set to do this. They're not capable of doing this. We look at Warren, we look at Wilson over in Ferguson. He simply was terrified of everything. If you go back and look at his history, he lived in a terrified world. He wasn't suited.
Right, stop vetting people for lack of empathy and start vetting people for actual empathy. Thank you so much. Yeah. Mike Papantonio, Ronald Hampton, thank you so much, both of you, for your incredible insight.